Hello everybody, my name is Timothy and I want to welcome you to the Learn Penang Hokkien YouTube channel where I'm doing a series of videos on the historical aspect of our local history, something which by learning about the past we can more appreciate the present. And today we are living in August 2025. I'm going to explain about an incident that happened also in August, but not in 2025. It happened a very long time ago in August 1867. And if you know your history, what happened in 1867? Some of you would know from history that in 1867, Penang, for the first time, and I believe the only time, we had a riot. And that riot remains in history from then until now, and is known as the Penang Riots of 1867. It happened from the 3rd of August until the 12th of August, or a span of roughly about 10 days. So within that 10 days, the people of Georgetown were too afraid. They cannot get out of their house. They were stuck indoors because there's fighting in the streets. And out of that 10 days or so, 4 of them was total chaos. It was like Georgetown has turned into a war zone. But why did the Penang riots happen? How did it happen? And what is the aftermath of that riots? We are going to explore it in today's video so that from here you'll have a clearer understanding of that particular part in Penang's history. And so, if you're ready, let's get cracking. Prologue, a city on the brink. Imagine walking down the narrow streets of Georgetown in the year 1867. The tropical air is thick with the scent of spice and the cries of hawkers. Ships from China, India, and Europe jostle for space along the busy quays. Coolies carry sacks of rice and tin ingots under the relentless sun, while merchants bargain over bales of opium and silk. Yet beneath the surface of this thriving port, tensions are brewing. Tensions that will soon erupt into one of the most violent episodes in Penang's history. Penang in the mid-19th century was a jewel in the Strait settlement, a free port that attracted migrants from across Asia. The Chinese community formed a large and influential part of this population, divided into various dialect and clan groups. Many belonged to powerful secret societies which, in the absence of strong colonial social structures, offered protection, employment, and a sense of belonging. Among these, two names dominated: the Hai San, linked to the Tua Pek Kong Society, also known as Kian Tek Tong, and their rivals, the Ghee. While officially the British colonial administration sought to maintain peace, its limited police force and laissez-faire policies meant that the secret societies often operated with impunity. For years, rivalries simmered over gambling farms, control of labor, and the right to collect protection fees. By 1867, these disputes had reached a breaking point. What would follow was not a brief scuffle in a back alley, but a week-long siege of the city itself. Streets would be barricaded, gunfire would echo through the heart of Georgetown, and the colonial government would be forced to confront a crisis it could no longer ignore. This is the story of the Penang Riots of 1867, a tale of power, pride, and the perilous balance between community loyalty and law. And it begins, as many great conflicts do, not in the chaos of battle, but in the quiet tension of everyday life. In the next chapter, we'll step into the Penang of the 1860s, a melting pot where trade, culture, and competition set the stage for conflict. Chapter 1: Penang in the 1860s, a melting pot under pressure. What happens when a city grows faster than the laws meant to govern it? In the Penang of the 1860s, prosperity brought opportunity, and with it, friction that no one seemed able to control. The island was a thriving entrepot at the heart of the Strait settlements. Its free port status attracted ships from China, India, the Malay archipelago, and Europe. Along Beach Strait, merchants conducted business in Hokkien, Cantonese, Tamil, Malay, and English, while in the bustling port area, stevedores and coolies unloaded rice, tin, and opium from creaking wooden lighters. The Chinese community formed the largest single ethnic group, yet it was far from united. Divided along dialect, clan, and regional lines, each group maintained its own associations, temples, and networks. Mutual aid societies provided social welfare, mediated disputes, and offered newcomers a path to employment. But these same organizations, particularly the secret societies, also acted as powerful self-governing entities with their own rules, enforcement, and rivalries. For many Chinese migrants, joining a society was a matter of survival. Without family or official protection, a man's safety and livelihood often depended on his gongsi. Among the most influential was the Tuak Pekong Society, also known as Kentek Tong, aligned with the Hai San faction. Its rival was the Ghee, a sprawling network with members across Malaya. Both drew strength from their links to the coolie trade, gambling farms, and other lucrative enterprises. The British colonial administration prided itself on order, yet its actual control was limited. With a small police force and a policy of non-interference in native affairs, the authorities largely left the societies to settle their own disputes until those disputes threatened public peace. In such a volatile environment, small sparks could ignite large fires. And in Penang, those sparks were beginning to fly. In our next chapter, we'll step behind the closed doors of the secret societies themselves to understand how the Hai San, the Tuak Pekong Society, and the Ghee operated, and why their rivalry would bring the city to the edge of war. Chapter 2: The Secret Societies, Hai San and Ghee. If the streets of Penang were alive with commerce, its real power often lay in the shadows, in organizations whose influence stretched from the docks to the tin mines and whose loyalties could mean the difference between safety and ruin. Among these, two names stood above the rest: the Hai San and the Ghee. Both were more than just gangs. They were networks of mutual aid, cultural preservation, and, when needed, armed muscle. In Penang, the Hai San were closely linked to the Tuak Pekong Society, also known as the Kentek Tong, which operated from its temple headquarters. To its members, the society was more than a political entity. It was a guardian of community interests, a spiritual home, and a place where disputes could be resolved without colonial interference. The Ghee, by contrast, were a sprawling federation whose roots stretched back to anti-Qing movements in China. They welcomed members from various dialect groups and operated across the Malay Peninsula. In Penang, they controlled significant labor networks and wielded influence in certain trades and neighborhoods. While both societies professed ideals of mutual aid, the reality was that they also competed over control over profitable enterprises, gambling farms, opium distribution, and labor recruitment. Members were expected to stand with their society in times of trouble, and loyalty was often cemented through elaborate initiation rituals, sworn oaths, and secret signals. The British administration viewed these societies with a mixture of caution and resignation. Officially illegal, they were nonetheless tolerated so long as they kept the peace. But peace was fragile. The societies were constantly engaged in a low-level contest for dominance, and when disputes arose, they were rarely settled in court. More often, they were resolved with sticks, blades, and increasingly firearms. This rivalry, simmering beneath the veneer of daily life, would soon boil over into open conflict. In Chapter 3, we'll trace the path from uneasy coexistence to open hostility as events between 1860 and 1867 steadily pushed the Haisan, the Tuapekon Society, and the Ghee towards the bloody confrontation that history now remembers as the Penang Riots. Chapter 3, Tensions Built, 1860 to 1867. How does a rivalry turn into war? Often it is not over one single event, but a chain of provocations, misunderstandings, and calculated moves that, over time, leave no path back to peace. In the years between 1860 and 1867, Penang's fragile balance began to tip. The Haisan, through the Tuapekon Society, also known as Kentek Tong, and the Ghee increasingly clash over control of economic lifelines, the gambling farms, opium dens, and most critically, the recruitment and management of Chinese laborers. These were not just business ventures, they were sources of political influence and community control. Disputes fled over territory in the town's Chinese quarters. A quarrel over the right to collect fees in one street might escalate into a show of force with dozens of men armed with sticks and cleavers squaring off in broad daylight. While some incidents ended quickly, others left blood in the streets and grudges that would be remembered for years. The colonial government, with its small police force, struggled to contain these eruptions. Official warnings were issued, leaders summoned for friendly talks, but the societies were too entrenched and their grievances too deep for these measures to have lasting effect. And here I have a question to you, my dear viewer. Do you have family stories or local legends about these years in Penang? Sometimes the oral histories passed down in families capture details and perspectives that never made it into the official records. If you know such stories, I'd love for you to share them in the comments. They will help to bring life to what we are talking about right now. And now let's continue. By 1866, the situation had worsened. There were reports of society members stockpiling arms, and rumors circulated that both sides were readying for a decisive showdown. The streets might have appeared calm to the casual observer, but beneath the surface, alliances were being forged, strategies discussed, and the city was holding its breath. In Chapter 4, we'll see what finally pushed the tension past the point of no return, the spark that set Penang streets ablaze. Chapter 4, The Spark Ignites. In every great street conflict, there is that one moment, the shove, the insult, the calculated strike that pushes simmering tensions into open battle. For Penang in 1867, the spark was sudden, but the fire it lit had been waiting to burn. Accounts differ on what exactly set off the Penang Riots. The colonial records suggest a quarrel between members of the Tuapekon Society, also known as the Kentek Tong, and the Ghee over a gambling dispute in late July. others, drawn from oral history, speak of an insult during a religious procession, where the positioning of banners were taken as a grave affront. Some tell of the so-called rambutan skin incident, in which the careless or deliberate tossing of a rambutan peel onto a member of the rival society was seen as an unforgivable slight. Another widely retold story is that of a funeral procession crossing paths with a rival group, where a misunderstanding over who should give way quickly escalated into a physical confrontation. Still others claim it was the culmination of a series of provocations, each small enough to ignore alone, but together impossible to overlook. Whatever the exact cause, the result was explosive. On the morning of the first clash, rival members confronted each other in the streets of Georgetown. Voices were raised, weapons drawn. A single gunshot, its source disputed, rang out. Then came the charge. Within hours, skirmishes broke out in multiple locations. The cries of the wounded carried through the narrow lanes, and shopkeepers hurriedly pulled down their shutters. Society runners dashed from one stronghold to another, summoning reinforcements. By nightfall, the first barricades were already being built, wooden carts overturned, timber planks nailed into place, barrels rolled into the streets. The city was dividing into zones of control. From the Colonial Police Office, officers sent urgent requests for reinforcements. But even as they moved to intervene, they found themselves blocked by hastily erected barricades and hostile crowds. The first day's violence had made one thing clear. This was no ordinary brawl, but the opening move in a full-scale urban war. In Chapter 5, we'll walk through the first day of Barricades, where they were built, how the battle lines were drawn, and how Penang streets became a maze of fortified positions. Chapter 5, Day 1, Barricades Rise. How do you turn an open street into a fortress? In Penang, on the first day of violence, the answer was simple. You used whatever you had on hand and you worked fast. As the first clashes erupted, both the Tuapekon Society and the Ghee moved quickly to secure their territory. In the narrow streets of Georgetown's Chinese quarters, cars were overturned, wooden planks nailed together, and heavy barrels rolled into place. Bamboo poles were lashed into makeshift fences. Anything that could slow an enemy's advance became part of the barricade. The barricades were not random. They were built to control choke points, cutting off entry into key neighborhoods. Entrances to lanes like Armenian Street, Cannon Street, and parts of Julius Street became heavily defended. Society members stationed at these barricades carried an assortment of weapons, from parangs and spears to the prized muskets and pistols smuggled in from traders who asked few questions. The first exchanges of gunfire echoed off the shop fronts. Smoke from gunpowder mixed with the acrid scent of burning wood as barricades were set alight to block passages. The streets became mazes. One wrong turn could lead you straight into enemy territory. For residents caught in the middle, the transformation was terrifying. Families stayed indoors, shuttering windows, while some fled through back alleys, carrying whatever belongings they could. The soundscape was unrelenting. Shouted orders in Hokkien and Cantonese, the pounding of hammers, and the crack of musket fire. By evening, both sides had established their lines. The Ghee controlled strongholds near the port and certain inner streets, while the Tuapekon Society fortified their temple area and adjoining lanes. The British police, few in numbers, could only watch and wait, wary of being drawn into the crossfire. In Chapter 6, we'll see how these barricades set the stage for a week of urban warfare, a siege fought street by street with each side trying to break the other's hold on the city. Chapter 6, the rise of the Peh-oe-ji society in Penang. What happens when a temple becomes more than just a place of worship? In the bustling streets of 19th century Penang, this was exactly what unfolded at the Peh-oe-ji temples. To the casual observer, these shrines were humble places where Chinese immigrants prayed for safety, good fortune, and success. But to those in the know, they were also the heartbeat of a powerful brotherhood that would quietly grow into one of the most influential Chinese secret societies on the island. By the mid-1800s, Penang's Chinese community was already a complex tapestry of dialect groups, trade guilds, and clan associations. Many immigrants, especially those without family or connections, turned to temple-based societies for protection and support. The Peh-oe-ji Society offered exactly that. A network rooted in shared beliefs, mutual aid, and loyalty. Its members were bound not only by faith but also by a code of fraternity that could be mobilized for both communal welfare and political influence. In practice, the society functioned like a dual entity. By day, it organized religious festivals, funded charitable works, and mediated disputes among Chinese settlers. By night, or behind closed doors, it acted as a highly organized secret society able to summon manpower, resources, and information at short notice. Its leaders, often prominent merchants or respected elders, balanced spiritual authority with pragmatic power. The Peh-oe-ji Society's influence wasn't confined to Penang. Through merchant networks and kinship ties, it established connections across Malaya and even back to the home provinces in China. In time, this allowed it to play a role in matters far beyond temple walls, from mediating inter-clan conflicts to shaping the balance of power among rival Chinese secret societies. And so, a deity's shrine had quietly transformed into the headquarters of a formidable organization, one that would later find itself at the heart of Penang's most turbulent events. Chapter 7, Reinforcements and Escalation. How does a local riot grow into a battle that shakes the entire island? By drawing in reinforcements from far beyond the scene. As the street fighting in Georgetown dragged on, both the Ghee and the San urgently summoned help from their allies in other parts of Penang and even from the mainland. The San, with strong connections to tin mining communities in Province Wellesley and Perak, quickly mobilized seasoned fighters. Many of these men had already seen action in the Larut conflicts, bringing with them not just courage but also firearms and explosives. Meanwhile, the Ghee drew support from their own networks, including secret society lodges in Butterworth and Kedah. Soon, the quiet arrival of small boats to Penang's shores carried fresh waves of combatants, each determined to tip the balance. The influx of men transformed the riots from a chaotic brawl into an organized conflict. Barricades were reinforced, new strategic points seized, and supply lines established to keep fighters armed and fed. The narrow streets of Georgetown echoed with the pounding of makeshift war drums, the crack of gunfire, and the shouts of orders in Hokkien, Cantonese, and Malay. For the British authorities, the situation had just taken a dangerous turn. What had begun as a violent dispute between rival groups was now swelling into a full-scale urban battle with hundreds of armed men on each side. The tension gripped the town, and it was clear that without decisive action, Georgetown could spiral completely out of control. Chapter 8. Civilians in the Crossfire. Imagine stepping out to buy rice for the family, only to find your street blocked by barricades, fighters shouting, and the smell of gunpowder heavy in the air. In Georgetown during those August days of 1867, for many ordinary residents, survival meant navigating a city-turned battlefield. The Penang Riots were not just a clash between the Tua Pekong society and the Ghee. They were a nightmare for shopkeepers, labourers, women, and children who had no stake in the society's rivalries. Oral histories passed down in Hokkien and Cantonese families recall how shutters were hastily slammed shut, streets were eerily quiet except for the sound of distant shouting, and neighbors whispered about which alleys were safe for that day. Some merchants, desperate to save their goods, negotiated with the fighters, offering rice, salt, and even cloth in exchange for being left alone. For others, there was no choice but flight. Families fled their homes, sometimes leaving elderly relatives behind because moving them was too dangerous. In kampongs outside the town centre, villagers recalled seeing streams of refugees carrying bundles on their backs, heading toward relatives' houses far from the fighting. The most harrowing stories come from those trapped between the barricades, literally caught in the no man's land between the two factions. Some hid in back rooms or under floorboards for days, rationing water and hoping stray bullets wouldn't find them. A few brave souls acted as go-betweens, slipping through side alleys to deliver messages or pleas for safe passage. Historians note that while British colonial reports often reduce these civilians to statistics, oral accounts give them their humanity back. They were not passive victims. They made hard choices in impossible circumstances, relying on wit, community ties, and sheer luck to survive. But while civilians sought safety in any way they could, the colonial authorities were making their own calculations, and soon they would take a more decisive role in the conflict. In Chapter 9, we'll see how the British administration tried to restore order in a city in flames. Chapter 9. Turning the Tide. In every prolonged street war, there comes a moment when the momentum shifts, when the side that seemed unstoppable began to falter, and the outcome tilts sharply toward one victor. For the Penang Riots of 1867, that moment came with the collapse of key barricades and the sudden loss of morale among one faction's fighters. The Tua Pekong society had held their positions with fierce determination, but as August wore on, British strategy became more coordinated. Using intelligence gathered from informants and with the help of European merchants desperate for stability, colonial forces began targeting the most vital barricades first. Heavily armed detachments advanced under cover of artillery fire from Fort Cornwallis, pounding wooden fortifications until they splintered. One breakthrough came along Beach Street, where a barricade that had stood for over a week was breached after hours of musket and cannon fire. Once the barricade fell, British troops and Allied police surged through, capturing a cluster of shophouses that had served as a forward base for Tua Pekong fighters. The loss of this stronghold not only deprived them of a strategic position, but also severed their supply line for food, ammunition, and reinforcements. internal weaknesses deepened the crisis. Weeks of fighting had drained resources and morale, and rumors spread of disagreements between certain leaders over strategy. Oral histories speak of fighters slipping away under cover of night, seeking safety in the countryside or in friendly kampongs. The Ghee, sensing opportunity, pressed their advantage, striking at other barricades and harassing retreating forces. By late August, the balance had shifted decisively. The once complex map of barricades and no-go zones began to shrink, with the Tuapekong society losing ground daily. The British, though cautious to avoid a full-scale massacre, were now firmly in control of the tempo of the conflict. In Chapter 10, we'll see how the fighting finally ground to a halt, not with a dramatic final battle, but through a combination of exhaustion, negotiation, and the quiet reassertion of colonial authority. Chapter 10, Aftermath and Arrest. When the gunfire faded and the barricades fell, Penang was left with more than silence. It was left with scars. Streets once bustling with trade were littered with broken timber, scorched debris, and the haunting quiet of those who would never return. In the days after the final clashes, the British moved swiftly to restore order. The wounded, both fighters and civilians, were carried to makeshift treatment stations set up in warehouses and community halls. Local doctors and volunteer nurses worked tirelessly, but supplies were short and some injuries proved fatal in the days that followed. The dead, numbering in the dozens by official records, though oral histories suggest far more, were buried quickly, often without ceremony, as health concerns mounted in the tropical heat. Then came the arrest. Patrols swept through Georgetown's alleys and shop fronts, detaining suspected combatants from both the Tuapekong Society, also known as the Kentek Tong, and the Ghee. Informants, some eager for British favour, others settling old grudges, named names. High-ranking figures from both sides were taken into custody, though in many cases, leaders had already fled to avoid capture. The investigations were methodical, if not entirely impartial. Witnesses were questioned in the colonial courtrooms, evidence were pieced together from confiscated weapons and intercepted letters, and trials proceeded under heavy scrutiny. For some, the verdict was exile from Penang, for others, lengthy prison terms or hard labour. A handful of prominent leaders received lighter sentences, fueling suspicion that political connection or strategic usefulness had swayed the hand of justice. By September, the visible signs of conflict were gradually cleared away. Shophouses reopened, ships returned to the harbour, and life resumed its rhythms. Yet beneath the surface, distrust lingered, the kind that no sentence or settlement could erase. In Chapter 11, we'll examine how the Penang Riots reshaped the island's society and politics, and how the uneasy peace that followed carried the seeds of future tensions. Chapter 11, The Calm After the Storm. How does a city heal after days of chaos? In the wake of the Penang Riots of 1867, Georgetown was left battered, its streets scarred by violence, and its people divided by suspicion. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, and in many neighborhoods, burnt-out shophouses stood as grim reminders of the fury that had swept through the settlement. The British authorities moved swiftly to restore order, imposing stricter policing and curfews. Troops patrolled the streets while the colonial government strengthened its intelligence network to monitor secret societies more closely. Public meetings were discouraged and gatherings of Chinese residents were watched with wary eyes. For the Haisan and Ghee societies, the riot had been costly, not only in lives and resources, but in political influence. Merchants and traders, whose businesses had been paralyzed by the fighting, now pushed for stability. The Penang Chamber of Commerce urged the government to invest in rebuilding the port's reputation as a safe trading hub. Yet beneath the surface, the tension had not entirely vanished. Secret societies still existed, quieter now, but far from gone. For the ordinary people of Penang, the aftermath was a mixture of relief and quiet resentment. Relief that the bloodshed had ended, resentment that the underlying grievances had not been addressed. In many ways, the riot was less a resolution than a pause in an ongoing struggle for power, identity, and survival in the multicultural melting pot of Penang. Now, what do you think? Did the measures taken by the colonial authorities truly restore peace, or did they merely suppress the problem until the next explosion? You have heard stories passed down about this uneasy peace. Share them in the comments below. Chapter 12: Aftermath and Lingering Shadows. Have you ever wondered what happened after the guns fall silent? When the smoke of battle drifts away and the victors and vanquished count the cost? In Penang, the end of the 1867 riots did not bring an immediate return to peace. The Haisan and Ghee societies had both suffered heavy losses in manpower, resources, and morale. For many, the wounds were not just physical but deeply personal. Brothers, friends, and business partners had been lost in a few days of chaos. The British administration, embarrassed by its inability to quell the violence swiftly, sought to reassert control. They tightened laws on the possession of weapons, increased police patrols, and placed informants within the Chinese community to monitor the activities of secret societies. Several prominent leaders were arrested or exiled, while others fled across the straits to the Malay states, hoping to escape British justice. Trade, which had ground to a halt during the fighting, slowly resumed. Yet trust between rival Chinese factions were fractured, and the memory of the riots lingered like an unwelcome ghost over the streets of Georgetown. For the ordinary Penangite, life eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the tension beneath the surface remained, ready to flare up again under the right conditions. Historians today see the Penang Riots of 1867 as more than just a violent clash between two secret societies. They were a turning point that forced the British to take Chinese secret society activities more seriously and to re-evaluate their governance of Penang. It also marked a moment when the Chinese community in Penang began to realize the high cost of unchecked rivalry. The story, however, doesn't end here. In the years following the riots, the same societies and their leaders would continue to influence events across the Strait settlements and the Malay states, from tin mining conflicts to political maneuvering. To understand how the ripples of 1867 spread far beyond Penang's shores, we must now step into the closing chapters of our tale. Epilogue: Lessons from 1867. The Penang Riots of 1867 were more than just an outbreak of violence. They were a collision of ambition, identity, and power in a small but vital port city. In just 10 days, Georgetown was transformed from a bustling hub of trade into a battlefield. And yet, from the ashes of that conflict emerged lessons about unity, resilience, and the fragile balance needed to keep a multicultural society at peace. Today, the events of 1867 were remembered in both the pages of history books and the oral traditions passed down through families. They remind us that behind every historical date are human stories of fear and courage, loss and survival, and the choices people made when the world around them catches fire. I would love to hear what you think. What struck you most about this episode in Penang's past? Do you have family stories, old photographs, or local tales connected to the riots? Ask your questions, share your comments. I really enjoy engaging with you and hearing your perspectives. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the Learn Penang Hokkien channel. And if you'd like to dive deeper into the history that surrounds these events, check out my other videos on related topics on Chung Keng Kui, Larut Tin Mining, the Hai San Secret Society, the Ghee Secret Society, the Tian Ti Hui, and Ko Le Huan. You'll find the links in the description below. History is not just something we read, it's something we remember, question, and keep alive together. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Kamsahamnida.